Welcome back to The Breakdown, an everyday analysis breaking down the most important stories in Bitcoin, crypto, and beyond. This episode is sponsored by ErisX.com, the Stellar Development Foundation, and Grayscale Digital Large Cap Fund. The Breakdown is produced and distributed by CoinDesk. Here's your host, NLW.
Welcome back to The Breakdown. It is Tuesday, May 26th, and those of you who listen regularly know that I spend a lot of time thinking about narratives. Narratives for me are the way that we make sense of complex phenomena. They're the way that we orient lots of information and make it make sense contextually. But narratives are a battleground. Narratives are constantly in flux, and narratives, because they interpret the world around us, different narratives offer different competing interpretations, and those tend to create political battle. You see this all the time in the crypto industry as people compete to define and explain what's important and why, and what people should spend their time on, and ergo where people should put their investment within. Narrative battlegrounds become the way that resources are allocated in some contexts like that. I think about narratives all the time, and I'm excited to have a guest today who thinks about narratives in a really unique way as well. My guest is Geoff Lewis. Geoff was previously at Founders Fund, where he led investments in companies like Lyft, and is one of the two founding partners of Bedrock Capital. When Bedrock Capital was announced in 2018, they announced it with a letter that got a lot of attention for talking about narrative violations. And effectively, their thesis was that instead of looking for companies that met the conventional wisdom about how the world was or how the world was changing, they were going to go look for companies that actually violated current narratives in ways that they thought were powerful and offered an opportunity for asymmetric return. As you'll see in this conversation, the idea of narrative violations is not something that I think is, strictly speaking, a venture capitalist or investing concept alone. I think it's about a way of seeing the world and trying to peel back narratives to understand what the counter narrative might be. I think especially now, that's a really important skill. Being able to see through narrative mirage, which is another term of Geoff's, is a really, really important skill. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And as always, interviews that are long like this, we edit only very lightly to keep the conversation as natural as it was. So with that, let's dive in. All right, we are back with Geoff Lewis. Geoff, thanks so much for joining.
Good to be here.
So I remember when you launched your venture fund, you launched it with a letter which got a ton of buzz, and the central conceit, or one of the central ideas, was the search for narrative violations. This is something that obviously that I think about a huge amount in just narratives in general. I think they're a hugely important and often under examined force in society and business. But I'd love to hear just from you what this idea of narrative violations really means, and how did this notion of organizing capital around it start to form?
Sure. So I'd start off by saying that it's sort of the power of narrative is sort of one of these things that that's sort of always been hiding in plain sight and in business. And so it's sort of like for the narratives to work, you can't explicitly talk about them in the context of being a narrative. And so there's a sense in which Bitcoin became a store of value because people believed that it was going to become a store of value. But if you actually said, well, we need this store of value narrative to work for Bitcoin to become valuable, it wouldn't have become valuable over time. So there's a sense in which the narratives are very powerful. They sort of have an impact across all areas of business, the markets, and then it's sort of very dangerous to talk about them explicitly as narratives because you might burst the bubble, and they might stop working. And so what we wanted to try and do with Bedrock was, in venture capital, there are sort of two ways that you can make money. You can either sort of invest in something that people generally believe is going to work. So you can be sort of more bullish than everyone else on something that folks are already bullish on. And so, recent examples of of that would be something like, Figma, which is sort of a design collaboration tool where sort of everyone's sort of felt it's going to work for a long time and folks can just compete to pay higher prices to invest. But there's sort of a consensus view that it's a business that's clearly working in the consumer space. Something like Snapchat, which has been doing well in the public markets. You can sort of, obviously Amazon is sort of consensus good company. So you can, and when these businesses are private, you can be more bullish than everyone else on something that everyone's bullish on, or you can be bullish on something that others are bearish on. So you can believe something's going to work that others just think is going to fail. In my case, Lyft would be sort of the modal example. When I led the financing round in that company, it was like everyone thought it was this crazy thing with these pink mustaches that was going to get destroyed by Uber. This was back in 2012. But with Bedrock, what we want to do is try and carve out this third way of actually what are businesses, what are markets that are just completely not captured in the narrative at all. So the narratives are always these hyper-polarized. It's either going to change the world and give way to this sort of utopia, or it's sort of going to destroy the world. And then technology, the narratives are especially polarized in a positive or negative direction. And so our whole idea around narrative violations, which we wrote in our letter, is can you find companies that are not captured in either one of those extremes and actually powerfully cut against or ignored by sort of the narrative. And I'll pause there. But sort of one of the implicit things in narrative violations is that the narratives tend to be have historically tended to originate from the media. So there's a sense in which narrative violations, investing strategy is kind of a contra legacy media investing strategy. So you sort of you would sort of want to avoid things that the legacy media is hyper focused on.
It's interesting. I think we'll talk a lot about media because I do think that it's a good note, I think, to start or to have right in this up front, where it is interesting how much of this new kind of mental space. It's interesting because in a lot of ways, and I think that you experience this a lot in your conversations on Twitter, you're bringing this idea of this as an investment discipline or investment strategy, but really it's kind of a way of seeing the world strategy that happens to have investing implications if you want to sort of apply it to that. I mean, is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, it's a fair thing to say. It's sort of how one can make money with it. So that's sort of why one would want to invest against it.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the parts of the letter, I was rereading it before our conversation, and you guys wrote, allowing a popular narrative to decide for you is the most seductive of shortcuts. And I thought that was a particularly insightful line. And so I guess, we're now living in this world where the narratives seem pretty up for grabs. I mean, is that your sense coming out of COVID, that there's been kind of a big Overton window shift on some previously firmly held narratives, or do you think it's been overstated because we've been living through this actually, I guess, let me clarify. Do you think that the scale of these shifts in people's bands of perception are truly expanded, or is that a momentary blip based on kind of the strange situation of quarantine?
Well, I'd like to believe that it's the I'd like to believe that it's the former, and so I'm certainly seduced by the idea of believing that folks actually realize that the narrative gatekeepers actually haven't really known what they're talking about, and the fact that we had sort of no comprehensive pandemic preparedness plan, and there was no sort of mobilization of all the smartest people in the country to back in February to figure out what we ought to be doing. And instead, it's sort of just been this haphazard disaster at literally every level, at the federal level, municipal level, the state level. It's the way in which the stimulus has been executed to me feels sort of extraordinarily dangerous. The cure, the sort of economic cure is going to be worse than the virus over many years. So certainly, it's seductive to believe that that everyone sort of sees that the emperors, quote unquote, have no clothes. But then at the same time, I actually feel that most people, you sort of experience. I think most people will just experience this as a sort of hyper traumatic event, and when a sort of hyper traumatic event happens, you sort of just want to forget that it happened and sort of move on with your life. And so I sort of think there's going to be this bifurcation where, on the one hand, there's the subset of the world that the Overton window has been sort of massively expanded for, and that's a very positive thing. And on the other hand, I worry that actually I worry that sort of not enough people sort of have the ability to think about these things in this way, and therefore it's sort of just weird, just this weird degradation. It's like everything is the way it was except worse, or something like that.
Yeah, it's, you know what, I was kind of watching. I think this is a strange thing to celebrate, but I think that there is actually something potentially good in the fact that the crisis of institutional leadership was so cross-cutting across every political perspective, every political party, every type of institution. You know what I mean? And there was a moment where I think, it could have been a conversation more broadly about the nature of those institutions that caused such spectacular failure. But instead, it as it seemingly always does, just created new battle lines around the same culture war, right? Like, instead of having a mass conversation about how we let ourselves get into this and what sort of structural things we need to change, it so quickly became the much easier, like, masks as a symbol for, what you already believed politically going into this. And that's perhaps not surprising, but certainly a bummer, I think, from where I'm sitting.
Yeah, it's been really disappointing. I sent this tweet early on in the epidemic that the virus broke woke, and I think that I think it probably did break the sort of woke, the old version of woke, but now there's sort of this even dumber. It's been replaced with sort of even dumber culture war around masks, around opening up or not. And I'd like to point out that I don't think this is a uniquely U.S. Phenomenon. So I would argue that actually, in most of the Western countries, there's sort of been versions of the same thing that sort of played out. It's sort of maybe less polarized, but there's this writer. France, obviously, one of the countries in Europe that's been quite hard hit, and there's this French writer Welbeck, and sort of. He writes in this open letter that he published about a month ago, sort of, try and translate it. The way the epidemic has panned out is remarkably normal. COVID-19 is a banal virus with no redeeming qualities. It's not even sexually transmitted. It will only push further the obsolescence of human relationships, and ends with, the West has not the eternal divine right to be the richest and most developed zone in the world. And that's sort of like the negative depressing version. And then, and of sort of how this maybe just sort of accelerates these maybe somewhat dystopic, depressing trends. And then maybe there is this, I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, somewhat optimistic. There's maybe this positive version where we realize that we can't, group communities in this sort of small, localized, decentralized way. Realize you can't depend on any of the legacy institutions. You have to build your own sort of hyper local, organizations. Maybe there's a crypto version of this with local ways that on a very local level you sort of try and build something new. But certainly it seems really bad for all of the legacy institutions, and quite bad for capitalism writ large in the West, I would say.
Yeah, let's. I mean, so I think that this idea of this as a force for localism is definitely a pretty clear outcome, and I think you're seeing that on multiple levels. Obviously, you're seeing it in the fact that communities have sort of had to step up and take care of each other, right? I mean, we were just talking about this before, but I live in a tiny little town in the Hudson Valley, and the main kind of sources of community support during this time have not been PPP loans. It's been the one restaurant that's still operating, doing free meals for families Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that are totally anonymous and no questions asked, right? So you're seeing kind of that sort of community resilience infrastructure kick back in, but I think that there's also this larger conversation about what it looks like to redesign the economy, more structurally to be resilient, or at least some people are thinking about that. And now it's interesting because, there are some sort of public market actors like Chamath who have talked about the need for resilience in the economy. But by and large, most of kind of the public market actors are just kind of rooting for more of the same and this V-shaped recovery. How do you see the conversation playing out about these larger structural shifts that we need in terms of the economy? Things like supply chains coming back home, the ability to manufacture masks or PPE or whatever it is, nearer, and how much is that going to be driven by kind of existing companies versus entrepreneurs from the ground up?
I think there's just going to be a complete 180 on the supply chain side, and so I sent out this. We've had this 30-year trend of offshoring, and so if you're a large company, you'd sort of hire a McKinsey to figure out how you can create a hyper complex sort of offshored supply chain to cut costs, and this is sort of the globalization story of the last literally 30 years. And I think that is for anything quote unquote essential. That is going to 180. You're going to have to do things within the U.S. And have basically, most of the supply chain within the U.S. I'd say there's other countries that we can partner with that aren't China specifically. So there's obviously Mexico. That relationship I think is going to become more important versus less important over the years to come. I'd argue we're going to have a more important relationship with India than we've had historically. So I think the era of the sort of somewhat globalized supply chain is not completely done, but certainly for essential things, having a much more localized supply chain is going to be important. And I do think there's a very solid startup opportunity there. I mean, certainly in a biotech context, there's a huge sort of entrepreneurial opportunity there with sort of a local supply chain for the drugs. I mean, the drug supply chains have historically had to be very dependent on China. That obviously has to change. In a sort of coordination, helping businesses reorganize their supply chains. I think there's probably a technology startup opportunity around doing that, which is quite interesting. And I think this is something that folks sort of intuitively understand. And so I tweeted this thing yesterday, which was sort of, I was sort of using McKinsey as a scapegoat or as a sort of, buzzword for globalization. I wasn't actually picking on McKinsey specifically, but I tweeted out, McKinsey wanted McKinsey, but for helping companies reverse whatever McKinsey's recommended over the past 30 years. And the idea there is really that era of helping companies globalize is just, I think that's just done because the sort of globalization, the whole predicate for globalization has been these ties with China, and that clearly is done now.
Yeah, that tweet definitely hit a nerve, right? I think the last time I looked, it was like more than 6,000 people had favorited it or something. So clearly there is there's a shared sensibility with that, or people just hate McKinsey. But
well, I think people are looking for scapegoats, and so I feel sort of bad about the tweet because it was like, well, it's sort of scapegoating McKinsey. It's not actually really McKinsey's fault. They were an actor in this system, and the system the system has just been really screwed up, and so I'd say it's a statement on people are extremely angry. People want scapegoats, but I think people viscerally feel and understand that this globalized world in which we could just be BFF with China and depend on them for these critical infrastructure needs from a supply chain standpoint, that era is done. I think people do viscerally understand that.
Support for this podcast and this message come from ErisX.
With ErisX, you can trade spot and regulated futures on cryptocurrencies through a licensed U.S.-based exchange. ErisX believes in fair access for all. Sign up today to take advantage of zero fees and learn more at erisx.com/consensus.
This episode is also sponsored by the Stellar Foundation. The Stellar Network connects your business to the global financial infrastructure, whether you're looking to power a payment application or issue digital assets like stablecoins or digital dollars. Stellar is easy to learn and fast to implement. Start your journey today at stellar.org/Coindesk. Our final sponsor is Grayscale Digital Large Cap Fund. In times like these, diversification is key. Consider Grayscale Digital Large Cap Fund, ticker symbol GDLC. It's the only publicly traded investment product that offers diversified exposure to large cap digital currencies, all from your brokerage account. For more information, visit grayscale.co/Coindesk. That's GRAY scale.co/Coindesk.
I think that part of why, part of your context, it's almost like there's another tweet that I think could be paired with it that you sent out, which is basically saying prediction that the people who create the next normal, who actually pave the path for the next normal, will not be those same people who crafted this ludicrous global supply chain dependency while self-actualizing solely through frequent flyer status. And I think that the point here, and I mean, I'm putting words in your mouth now, is there's a sense of, you see all of these companies like doing 180s literally overnight and trying to, like, getting contracts from cities to reimagine things. You know what I mean? And it's sort of like, it's a little bit of a bitter pill to swallow, that they're just able to kind of shift on a dime and reposition themselves as experts in this new thing, which is by definition, because it's new, a thing that people don't really have expertise in.
Yep, totally. Totally agree. It's going to be this new crop of companies, of people. And then I think I always like to think in terms of time scales. And so, one of the things implicit with narrative violations is something can be a narrative violation, be counter narrative at one moment in time. So there was a moment in time at which remote work, many years ago, things like Zoom, Slack that would enable remote work were counter narrative, were narrative violations. That was a good moment in time to invest. Now those are popular narratives, the narrative of remote work, work from home. So it's arguably a sort of overheated moment in time. I wouldn't necessarily want to get involved in sort of remote work companies today as an investor. There's the time scale element to this. And I think that there is a massive time scale element to the shift that we're now going through. So I think folks are tempted to be like, oh, well, we're reopening. And so it's going to be like a year or 2 years and we sort of, can repair things. But actually, I think we're sort of, there's like a 10-year time horizon where just all of these things are going to change. I sort of liken this to a platform shift like the iPhone. It's been just this consumer behavior shock to the system. And so there's going to be this sort of 10-year wave of new innovations that ideally will come out to address new needs that we didn't have before pre-virus. And so I think folks have a tough time thinking in 10-year time horizon increments, but that's actually the type of time scale that this is all going to play out on. And so that's a long-winded way of saying, maybe McKinsey will pick up a few projects over the next few months, but long term they're kind of screwed.
Yeah. Well, and there are people who are going to, there's a lot of people who are having kind of those heterodox ideas validated now, right? Like one person that we've had on the podcast before is Peter Zane, who wrote Disunited Nations. And it looks particularly prescient now in the context of this. And it's basically arguing that, we were in the next 10 years going to end this era no matter what. It's just that Corona did it in massive fashion. And so I think that, in the same way as sort of like those ideas were out there, right? But again, they were kind of lurking in these narrative violations versus kind of in the mainstream. And you might see the people and companies who are in those spaces start to emerge now. So another question for you that I want to actually come back to work from home and maybe just, we'll go through a number of the different pertinent narrative battlegrounds almost right now. But before that, so a piece that you tweeted out, which I also really liked, John Luddig wrote this great piece about the tailwinds in venture capital. And the argument was basically that we're shifting in a kind of an era way away from just the total blue oceans, westward. I was almost thinking about the westward expansion when there was just so much of America to claim. And then at some point it started to get competitive. And the thesis is that you're starting to see actual zero-sum competition. You're going to see more zero-sum competitions between internet companies because you don't just have the kind of unlimited tailwind of growth of just more people coming online, more people spending more time online, right? At some point, people are spending as much time online as they can. And a lot of his piece is about why venture capital might need to shift back towards being really about vision, because there's going to be a new financial infrastructure, things like Clearbank that fund debt, right, and change the way that even these new companies fund themselves. I wonder, do you think that this sort of 10-year shift that you're describing of a real reworking of the global economy is a new space that is it basically a new type of tailwind? The sense that we have to kind of start a mass scale project to redesign the economy to bring it back closer to us, at least around these essentials. Does that create a kind of a different tailwind for venture capital, for entrepreneurs?
I'd like to believe that would be sort of the positive version of it. I worry that actually, certainly in the world of the internet, which I think is what John Luddig, former colleague at Founders Fund, really focused on his piece, talking about software, talking about innovation on the internet, might sort of abstract sense, not having thought about it, would be that actually what we're getting through COVID is this crazy acceleration in internet ubiquity from everyone being at home, which would basically mean that once we're on the other side of this, we'd see an even faster deceleration because we'll be closer to full internet penetration than we were before. But definitely, if there's sort of I'd almost argue that that it's actually not even clear that this is going to not even clear this is going to there's a positive version to the John argument. Now, all of that said, it does feel like we're at sort of version 2.0 of all of these key things. So like video conferencing, online education, online entertainment. We've got versions of companies doing these things. So there's Zoom, there's the online education companies, an investor company called Lambda School, which is one of them. Other, obviously the streaming companies. It seems like streaming is probably the most baked in terms of the table set of who the players are. I'd certainly say that the video conferencing, it feels like there's actually just a lot of room for new entrants there. And yeah, it'll be sort of zero-sum competitive. Or it's sort of quite winner take all, but I don't think Zoom is sort of the terminal video conferencing company. I'd say online education, huge open field, and that's going to be less zero sum than video conferencing. There can be multiple winners, and it's really unclear what those companies are going to be. I'd say we're just getting started on something Balaji, mutual friend of ours, I think, calls this decentralized healthcare. The idea of, obviously telemedicine, but that's just sort of piece one of, you could imagine, just a much more decentralized healthcare industry, and it feels like that's a big white space, and so yeah, there is potentially this set of new tailwinds, but I think the Luddig argument is just basically is just more true now than it was pre-COVID.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's interesting, the online education piece, kind of validating what you were just saying. So I spent a couple years, a long time ago now, 6 or 7 years ago, with a company called Learn Capital, which was one of the first San Francisco investors to focus on education exclusively as like it wasn't a double bottom line fund, right, where they were trying to have social impact as well. It was just a traditional venture fund. In fact, I think that their first fund was a carve out from Founders Fund way back in the day.
Really?
That was before I joined. Yeah.
Well, I don't like
Yeah.
double bottom line. I don't like double bottom line funds. So good to hear that wasn't one of those. Those never work.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was just, it was their whole thesis was like, look, this is a hugely important, economically massive area of the economy. Like you can have good, like it's not that they didn't care about the sort of the social impact of things. It's just going to be a byproduct of funding good companies. But it was interesting because at that time, I got in, I joined, well, one, because I thought that the guys who were running it were incredibly smart and I really wanted to learn from them. But two, because to me, the education system is one of the singular most broken things. I mean, it absolutely destroys people's ambition in so many contexts. And I think, it needs a total structural reimagination. The problem was when I got into it is that the most valuable thing you could be doing in education in 2011, 2012, 2013 was to basically get a big piece of the, effectively regulatory capture or capture, government dollars going into local schools. So as more dollars became available for kind of mandated technology to communicate between parents and students, going and capturing that was much more interesting economically than starting a big new version of a company, right? General Assembly was one of the investments back in the day. And it's just more valuable to go after the kind of the K-12 normal market. I think that when you start to see an actual opening in the higher education model and that huge money honeypot for reimagining things and designing it differently, you're going to see a lot of new entrants to the space that look really radically different than what we've seen before.
Yeah, so I agree with that. And then I think the challenge on it is that a world in which we can actually have the truly disruptive online education innovation writ large. So by that I mean sort of the end of 4-year residential colleges with a few exceptions. A world in which that's sort of the rise of sort of more decentralized, not necessarily homeschooling, but certainly a sort of much more decentralized approach to K to 12. A world in which that's true, I think, is a world in which basically the virus ends up being really, really bad. And so I don't know if we want to live in that world. Because
we don't root for that much.
What you need to disrupt sort of people's willingness to go to campuses. So it needs to be bad enough where people aren't going to go to campuses anymore because you're sort of too congregated in large groups. And I have a tough time sort of, I don't actually think that's the direction we're heading. And so the online education, decentralized education, there's maybe these narrow areas. I think there are these narrow areas where you can build these large companies. And so we're optimistic on something like a Lambda school or, something maybe like an out school where you can maybe narrowly with Lambda build it with reskilling for tech and tech adjacent jobs. You can maybe narrowly build it with homeschooling, with Outschool or Wonder School or those companies. And then to have a sort of huge paradigm shift, I think maybe the virus would have to be worse than it is, and I don't want that to happen.
Yeah, I agree, actually. I think, and this is my general feeling, maybe this is a good context actually to get into work from home. I think that we have this tendency when we're talking about these shifts, and it's understandable, right? Because you kind of zoom out to like, well, what's the opposite of the system we have now? And is that what we're headed into? When really what a lot of times these shifts look like, I think, is natural market forces of increased choice coming back in some ways, right? And so, for me, going back to your point, I think what we'll start to see with higher education is not, a closure of all these 4-year universities. It'll be a different calculation among people about what the cost benefit analysis is, which might put pressure on certain parts of the market, to reduce prices. Or you might see a lot more Lambda school for X, right? And I think that a lot of the success of those perhaps industry focused training things will be about, do companies actually decide that they like hires from those areas, right? If you started a Lambda school for marketing would the DDBs and whatever of the world actually hire those people, or are they just going to be looking for kind of traditional paths? And who knows? But it's going to be less. My guess is that it's less a full scale shift from one paradigm to another, and more just these things kind of creeping around the margins and creating more optionality. And I think that we were talking about work from home in a similar light. You've had kind of an interesting journey following on Twitter for the last 2 months or so in your work from home thoughts. Take us through kind of how you thought about it at the beginning, and then how it's kind of shifted to where you are now.
Sure. So I've been pretty schizophrenic on it for many years, and certainly gotten more so over the past few months. And so I've long thought it's what we would call a narrative mirage. So it's sort of this thing where, as you've articulated, it can maybe exist on the margins. It works for some companies to be fully remote, but it's sort of an overhyped sector. You've got sort of 1 million remote work enablement and collaboration tool startups out there. They're all, really well funded, lots of competition among VCs who invest in them. So sort of long thought it was sort of this overhyped area, because ultimately I'm a big believer in you get a lot more, you will give a lot more and get a lot more out of your work if you feel sort of very deeply interpersonally connected to the people you're working with. Saying there's something sort of elemental to work, to sharing a space with people, being live with them in person, which meant that sort of remote work would never fully take over. And then just on a more basic level, if you're the CEO of a company, you sort of, I think in the old paradigm, wouldn't want your teams all working remotely, because you want to actually be making sure people are actually working by seeing them in the office. And that's sort of the easiest proxy for seeing if people are actually working is are they in the office doing things on their computers? And so had been quite skeptical of it. Obviously, we've seen just an insane acceleration in remote work over the last few months, given everyone in a white collar job has basically had to work remote in almost every state. And so I basically, where I've netted out is it's incidentally the hype was warranted because of this COVID acceleration. So there certainly is going to be a lot more remote work across the board. But I think it is actually going to be predominantly concentrated in areas that are going to be less and less important in the future. And so in terms of functioning within a company. And so I'd say that I actually I think it's real, but actually there are these anything that's sort of essential, the essential worker categories. Those folks can't really work remotely, and the blue collar categories that sort of we're going to become increasingly dependent on, certainly in a context where we're inshoring wide swaths of our supply chain over the next decade. Those folks can't work remotely. And then I don't think the hybrid really works. I think you have to be either entirely remote or entirely in the office. And so I'd say the hype to date has been justified, but I think we're probably on the verge of remote work being overhyped yet again. And then we'll probably land at an equilibrium where, there's some companies that are fully remote. It works well. I think it'll work well for a number of the large Silicon Valley companies that, you don't really need that many people to do much work because they're sort of natural monopolies. So like a Google would be an example in search. And then I think there'll be a subset of companies that you actually will have employees and their families will actually co-locate with the company, like a resurgence in company towns. So you have the Citadel hedge fund did a version of this where Ken Griffin, the founder, moved all of their traders into the Four Seasons Palm Beach. I think they're all still there to do sort of a makeshift company town. And I think in certain key essential industries, certainly in the food supply chain, other areas, you might see a resurgence in company towns where families co-locate with their company. And then I think there's going to be a lot of companies that just have to take all of the all of the public health, quote unquote, public health stuff that you'd expect, or many people would expect a government to take care of. We'll just have to privatize that and do it themselves, that people can come into the office. So that's like, all of the basic sanitization, temperature checking, symptomatic surveillance, et cetera stuff. I think that's going to have to just be executed by companies, because I think a lot of companies are just going to go back to offices.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting point that there's the question of how hybrid you can make it versus it being kind of a structural decision from the ground up will be really interesting to see. What are other areas, as you're sitting here and thinking about narrative mirages versus real shifts that you think are, I guess, what are narrative battlegrounds that you're watching right now in terms of trying to understand how much things are going to change post COVID-19?
I'd say that one I'm quite obsessed with is the media, and so I sort of argue that that may be one area where things really do change going forward. Is the legacy media's just gotten so many things so wrong at this point that I think this might be the breaking point where it actually does go in a much more decentralized direction. You see early efforts, things like Substack, that sort of enable anyone to start their own media company. Certainly, you can monetize a following on Twitter through someone like the guy behind Stratechery, this very well known technology newsletter. Ben Thompson has been able to really prove there's a business model there. Someone like Jessica Less with The Information has done it on a larger scale, and so I think that there could be a wave of citizen journalists, decentralized media. I think that's a very interesting area to watch. I think the whole idea. Well, I don't believe we're going to see the sort of end of the 4-year residential sort of liberal arts college in the United States, unfortunately, yet. I do think that it's sort of the end of career tracks. And so, when I graduated college in 2004, there was sort of the consulting, iBanking, brand management type tracks. If you had a business degree that you would go on, for a number of years recently, there was sort of like, well, you would do product management or software engineering or finance or consulting still stuck around. And I do actually think it's the end of those tracks. And I think we're going to see people are going to just be doing much more idiosyncratic things. And there's probably business built around that. And so you'll sort of have these weird idiosyncratic influencers in all of these micro niche areas. It's kind of like what you do. You're sort of this idiosyncratic influencer. And I think there can be millions and millions of people like that own these specific niches. And I'm really quite interested in what are the tools that can enable those folks, because that is kind of the direction I think things are going. There's a sense in which being an influencer in a sort of very narrow area, having a highly engaged but relatively small audience, is kind of like now the new aspirational thing to do versus joining a McKinsey.
Yeah, it's really interesting too. I think that what people have discovered is that these niches, because of the power of the internet to converge people of shared interest, these niches can actually support an individual like it really, really well, right? From an economic standpoint, even if they're really narrow. I mean, you see this too, not just with kind of the types of things that I'm spending time on, but like in gaming, right? You can have obviously the people look at the biggest Twitch streamers all the time, but there's this huge long tail of games that have enough of an audience to support some number of independent media professionals, basically, who are creating content, and it turns out the economics as an individual look really different when you start to rehabituate people to also pay for content that they like. whether it's directly in terms of subscription, like Ben Thompson's newsletter, or just in terms of kind of the the streaming monthly subscription type things, which don't really get you anything different. It's just a way of supporting those creators. I think that's I tend to agree that I think that is an early trend. I also think that we still are at the front end of figuring out the right ways to monetize it. Like if you look at the difference in the Chinese podcasting market versus the American podcasting market, it's massive from a revenue standpoint, and it's because
subscription. It's wild. It's wild that we don't have that. That it feels like that shift is definitely going to happen here over the next number of years. Sorry, keep going.
No. So let me ask you a question too about. I think that the media thing is particularly interesting. My vantage point is influenced a little bit by the particular kind of business niche that I'm in the context of the Bitcoin industry, because this is, I think, one of the things that's fascinating is that you have independent media brands that grow up alongside the kind of the mainstay media brands, right? You have CoinDesk and The Block, but then you have a lot of people who are getting their analysis not from those sites, but from kind of the independent voices that they can subscribe to, either via podcast or whatever it is. And I would argue that a lot of those folks are as influential as anyone at these media sites. And I don't think that's basically, by the way, a knock on the kind of the legacy style media. I think it may just be a different paradigm. In fact, my relationship with CoinDesk is I'm independent but partnered with them for distribution, which is, I think, a really interesting and very different way to go about it. And when you start to see, the Matt Taibbi's of the world who left Rolling Stone to start their Substack do that more and more often, you're going to have a kind of power shift in the relationship between people that could get really interesting. And I think that we're, right now, I know that one of the things you've been noticing or spending time on too is we're seeing kind of it feels like a new all-time high or apex in some of that in terms of the kind of the individual influencer power of both Rogan and more recently during this quarantine of Dave Portnoy from Barstool Sports.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say there's this sort of, there's this sense in which we're so I'd say Portnoy and Rogan are different. And so I think with Rogan, I think the Rogan story is maybe a story of actually of the power of platforms. And so sort of like someone like Rogan, you think about him just in the context of society, he's probably like the most well-liked person in America. So, he's someone who could, if he ran for president, he'd probably win. He is just universally, I don't think there's anyone in America who would say they dislike Joe Rogan. One could argue whether he's overrated or underrated, but certainly he's very likable, has a huge audience, and really can get anyone he wants on his show. And sort of the fact that sort of you did this deal with Spotify, sort of this 3-year type deal, to me is more of a comment on the power of platforms. I would have expected Rogan to have created his own platform or something like that. Mm-hmm. I would have hoped he would have created his own platform versus someone like Portnoy, who he founded Barstool Sports. Now he's sort of become a media personality, sort of going in I would argue maybe a different direction of might actually be doing more of the trying to have political influence or create his own platform or something like that. But I guess with Rogan, my feeling is I'm a little bit disappointed because if like the most loved person in the country, if like this is it for him, this reported 100 million, it's probably a fair amount more Spotify deal. It's like, wait, does that put a cap on what you can actually do as an influencer, and how does that impact sort of the influencer economy? My hope is that he's just this idiosyncratic person, and it doesn't. But I was actually somewhat disappointed with that news, although I'm a fan of Spotify.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually. I think It was fascinating to see people's Insta reactions. And, in general, people are free to do whatever deal they want. And it's a ridiculous amount of money for something you created from scratch, so respect whatever the logic was. But it was funny to see people who are like, oh, this makes so much sense. He's been so worried about YouTube censorship. He's been talking about it all the time. And it's like, well, the answer to that is to move to a different centrally controlled platform and negate your ability to put this thing on any other platform. It's like, that's not an answer to censorship, but I do think, one of the things that it also brought up for me, which specifically with podcasting, is that I realized that we don't really know what the half-life of a podcast is supposed to be, right? We have a rough sense of how long a TV series lasts, even though that's also shifting based on different models and how Netflix does things versus how HBO does things or whatever. But if you have a successful show, you're expecting it to go 7 or 8 seasons, right? If it's a drama, maybe a little bit longer if it's a comedy or something, a sitcom that doesn't matter. We have no idea. Are most podcasts 3-year things and then they do a different podcast? Are they 5-year things? Are they 10-year things? It's early enough in the medium that it's actually hard to know. And I think part of, there were some people who pay more attention to Rogan than I do, who were like, dude seems tired. And if you're tired and all of a sudden, and who knows what sort of pressure he feels being the middle ground for everyone, it seems like sometimes, or it could seem like, and someone offers you a ridiculous 9-figure deal, like maybe you just, of course you're going to take it. But I do think it's an interesting question that you bring up of what it means in terms of the full upside potential of an independent kind of media enterprise.
Yeah. Really, really, really good point. And I don't think we fully understand the value of the back catalog either on these podcasts. And so, there's a sense in which most of the revenue in the historical sort of cable television paradigm, the bulk of the revenue was sort of from reruns actually. And maybe there's some version of that that's true for podcasts. I don't know. I think it's too early.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, I've picked your brain on a ton of different things and really appreciate the time. Maybe just by way of wrapping up, you had one other tweet that I thought was really, really interesting. And I want to see, it's a month on from when you said it. And I want to see if you still feel this way or if it's evolved at all. So this was on April 30th. You tweeted out, if you run a zombie company, now is the time to try and sell it. If you work for a zombie company, now is the time to change jobs. It'll be years until folks are as optimistic on the economy as they're going to be over the next 3 months. Narrative Mirage recovery. So first, I guess, what did you mean by narrative mirage recovery? And second, how has the last month changed or reaffirmed this take?
Oh, I believe it now more than ever. And so I would say that it's a narrative mirage recovery because basically the Fed is it's sort of the perma QE Fed money printing on steroids plus HGH. The amount of stimulus that's gone in is just insane. And then the reality is just that can't do it. You can't infinitely do it. And so I'd say that it's very much a narrative mirage recovery. That'll become clear starting in Q4. And then the reality is actually, I think, regardless of the fact it's a narrative mirage recovery, the U.S. is on a relative basis still better off than most other countries. You mentioned Peter Zane. I think he makes the argument quite articulately that sort of on a relative basis we're still probably better off than most other places. But that doesn't mean that it's that the economic miracle is going to continue. I think it's now come to a screeching halt, and that'll become clear to folks toward the end of the year.
Geoff, awesome to talk to you. Great to get your insights. Let's do this again sometime.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, man. My pleasure.
The thing that stands out to me after that conversation is this idea of how much we think things are going to change when we see a new force for change in society. So the work from home example and the higher education example were the two that we discussed most extensively in this context. But we have this tendency to assume or somehow get into this headspace that when new forces present themselves, it's going to change things wholly and immediately, rather than being a gradual, incremental process where first bits in the margins start to change, and then it slowly goes more mainstream until big swaths of what was previously outside the mainstream have become normalized. I think that's what you're going to see in higher ed, as I mentioned in the show, where different industries get their own version of Lambda School, get their own version of Y Combinator that becomes as, if not more, respected than traditional degrees. I think that's what's going to happen with work from home. I don't think that cities are all of a sudden going to lose their appeal overnight, but there's big sets of people demographically with different types of interest who are going to design their lives around the ability to work from home now, and that's all of a sudden going to be massively more respected among corporations. I think that it's really important not just to peel back narratives, but also to look at both scale and breadth of impact over time and really try to have a more nuanced view of the world. Anyways, that is my battle and my cross all the time, this idea of bringing nuance to digital conversations. Anyways, I appreciate you at least allowing me to do that by hanging out with you today. Until tomorrow, guys, be safe and take care of each other. Peace.